My name is Henry, and this is the story of how I got erased from my own family during Christmas dinner. One moment I was carving the turkey I'd roasted since dawn. The next, my son Michael stood up, held his wine glass high, and declared, "We voted. You're no longer part of this family." That was it. No discussion, no warning, just betrayal wrapped in a holiday smile. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply handed him a folder and walked out, because what they didn't know was that I had already seen this coming. I had built a quiet plan, one detail at a time, just like the blueprints I used to draw before retirement. You see, I gave them everything: my time, my savings, my home. But that night, I decided to take it all back. Before we begin this story, I want to ask, where are you watching from, and how old are you? Don't forget to subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories for more powerful tales like this one. Christmas dinner smelled like turkey and betrayal. The lights twinkled. The table was set with my late wife's best china, and yet the air was thick with something colder than the snow outside. Michael, my only son, stood at the head of the table, wineglass in hand, his jaw tight with purpose. I should have seen it coming. He cleared his throat like he was about to make a toast, but instead he looked me straight in the eye and said, "We voted. You're no longer part of this family." The words didn't echo, they stabbed. My fork hovered over the mashed potatoes, but suddenly food didn't matter. Nothing did. I glanced around the table. My cousins looked stunned, unsure whether this was some kind of joke. Emily, Michael's wife, smirked slightly, like she had rehearsed this moment in the mirror. I didn't flinch. Instead, I set my fork down quietly and reached into my coat pocket. "Here's a parting gift, son," I said, handing Michael a plain manila folder. His brows furrowed as he opened it, and when he saw what was inside, he screamed. He had no idea that moment, his moment of triumph, was the exact second I took everything back. But before that folder, before this explosion, there was erosion, slow, calculated, and quiet. It started with small comments. "Dad, this house is getting old. Don't you think it's time to modernize? You wouldn't understand. Things are different now." I brushed them off at first. After all, Michael lived here rent-free. I figured he was venting about life. But Emily's tone was sharper. She eyed the furniture like a real estate agent appraising someone else's assets. Her phone was always out, scrolling through luxury listings and sleek modern kitchens. One night, she left her screen tilted just enough for me to see a photo of a leather sectional that cost more than my old pickup truck. Then came the contractor estimate. Michael tossed it on the table like it was gospel. "We need upgrades, Dad. New floors, modern lighting, maybe knock down a wall or two." I didn't even need to look at the paper. I already knew they'd spent every dollar in their minds. My savings were a target, not a legacy. When I reminded Michael that he'd never paid rent here, not once, he called me selfish. Imagine that. A man who worked overtime shifts, sold his car to pay for his kids' college, being told he was the problem. Emily jumped in with her usual venom. "We're doing you a favor by living here." Her words dripped with entitlement. I sat still, tracing the scratch on the table Michael had etched when he was 10. Back then, I saw him as a dreamer, my little boy. Now he stood over me like a judge ready to hand down a sentence. And that's when it hit me: this wasn't about helping me. It was about removing me. They didn't just want my money, they wanted my name erased from this house, from this family, like I never existed. That's when something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to listen, smile, and document every insult, every false story they spread about me to the rest of the family. Because if they wanted a war, I'd give them one on my terms. Silent, calculated, and devastating. The dining room that once held birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet mornings with my late wife now felt like a courtroom. and I was on trial. Michael was pacing like a prosecutor, waving a stack of papers in the air, some contractor estimate inflated with luxury nonsense and vanity upgrades. "You've got the money, Dad?" he snapped, voice sharp enough to rattle the wine glasses. "What's the point of hoarding it? You're not getting any younger." That was the blow he thought would break me, the reminder of my age, my supposed irrelevance. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I looked down at the table and traced a deep scratch near my plate. It was carved by Michael's butter knife when he was 10, a moment I'd once found charming. That scar on the wood had outlived his gratitude. "I've given you enough," I said evenly, keeping my eyes on that old mark. "You live here rent-free. That's more than most get from their fathers." Emily chuckled, a cold, precise sound. "Rent-free, Henry. This place is a museum. We're doing you a favor by staying here." She said it without irony, her manicured nails tapping a rhythm of disdain against her wine glass. I looked up, slowly, studying her. She was always dressed like she'd just stepped off a magazine shoot, always posting, always posing, but never present. The house wasn't a home to her. It was a project, a brand. And I was the old fixture that didn't fit the aesthetic. Michael slammed his spoon down. "You're so damn selfish. You think you're some kind of saint, but you're just holding us back." His voice bounced off the walls, shattering the silence like a stone through glass. I didn't move. I'd heard him raise his voice before, but this time was different. This wasn't frustration. It was finality. Emily watched him like a director pleased with her lead actor's performance, a faint smile curving at the corners of her mouth. She was waiting for this moment. Maybe even planned it. I could have shouted back. I could have reminded him of the overtime shifts, the missed holidays, the car I sold, so he could have a shot at college. I could have reminded him that when his mother was dying of cancer, I held this family together while he stayed out late, pretending not to hear her crying. But what would be the point? Words wouldn't reach him anymore. The boy who once clung to my hand in the grocery store had been replaced by a man drunk on entitlement. "Selfish," I said again, softly this time, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. Michael leaned in, his breath hot with wine and arrogance. "You're damn right. You're not needed here anymore, Dad. We can handle this place without you." There it was. Not a request. A declaration. The air grew heavy the way it does before a thunderstorm. Emily's lips twitched with satisfaction. I set my fork down, slowly, deliberately, the metal tapping against the plate like the gavel of a judge. Then I stood. The chair scraped back with a screech that made several guests flinch. My boots felt heavier than usual as I walked toward the hallway, each step echoing off the hardwood floor. Michael's voice followed me, mockery laced in every syllable. "What, that's it? You're just going to sulk off now?" I didn't answer. I didn't turn. I reached for the doorknob, the chipped paint cold under my hand. Behind me, laughter returned to the table in awkward ripples, but I was already gone, cloaked in the silence of a man who had nothing more to say and everything left to do. My bedroom felt more like a tomb than a retreat. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the low murmur of voices downstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, the frame groaning under my weight. The mattress, familiar in all the wrong ways, lumpy, tired like me. A single lamp cast a soft, amber glow across the room, catching specks of dust that floated through the air like memories, refusing to settle. On the nightstand was a framed photo of Elizabeth holding a 6-year-old Michael, his gap-toothed smile wide and pure. My fingers brushed the glass, lingering there longer than I should have. I had once believed I was building a legacy for him. I thought he'd carry on the family name, preserve the life I'd built with sweat and sacrifice. I thought wrong. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out an old leather-bound photo album, the spine cracked from age and use. It was a relic from a time when life still had structure, when love hadn't yet soured into obligation. Flipping through the pages, I paused at a photo of Michael at 16 holding a football and grinning ear to ear. I remembered how proud I was when he made varsity. I remembered the second job I picked up to cover his cleats and gear. I remembered the night I sold my Chevy to pay for his college applications, telling Elizabeth it was just a car. She'd squeezed my hand and said, "It's never just a car when it's your dream." We both thought it was worth it. Back then, we still believed in the future. I turned another page and found his graduation photo. I worked double shifts that year, my back aching from long hours on construction sites, just to pay for that cap and gown. He hugged me that day, whispered he'd make me proud. But he never said thank you. Not once. And after Elizabeth passed, he started visiting less. By the first anniversary of her death, he didn't even call. Then came Emily with her polished nails, curated smiles, and taste for things that didn't belong to her. She didn't change him. She amplified him. Or maybe she revealed the part of him I refused to see. The ambition without conscience. The hunger without gratitude. I closed the album with a quiet snap, setting it aside like a chapter finally ended. Across the room, a shadow moved slightly as snow drifted outside the window, the flakes big and slow, blanketing everything in white. I stood and walked to the glass, pressing my palm against the cold. My reflection stared back, gray hair, tired eyes, and a jaw set with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I had spent decades as the provider, the fixer, the man who quietly swallowed his hurt to keep peace. But tonight wasn't about peace. It was about reclaiming what was mine. I didn't raise a son just to be told I was disposable. I didn't pour my life into this home to be treated like an unwanted tenant. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and stared at the screen. Tom's name was near the top, an old friend from my engineering days, now a retired attorney who still knew how to sharpen a blade without drawing blood. My thumb hovered, then tapped. The call rang once before he answered, his voice gravelly from years and bourbon. "Henry," he said. "What's going on?" I looked back toward the bedroom door, the house that once held my dreams now echoing with betrayal. "They voted me out, Tom." I said, my voice low but steady, "and I think it's time I voted back." He didn't say a word for a second, then he chuckled low and dark. "It's about damn time." And with that, the tide turned. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, the early light cutting through the blinds like slivers of judgment. The coffee pot hissed behind me, untouched. My hands moved slowly over the cluttered surface of the oak table, the same table where Elizabeth once served Sunday breakfast and Michael built model airplanes. Now it was a battlefield of unpaid bills, crumpled receipts, and mortgage notices they'd carelessly left out. Michael had no idea what kind of mind he was dealing with. I hadn't just built homes. I designed them. I knew how to find a structure's weakness. I knew how to break it down quietly, precisely, completely. I flipped through a stack of bank statements, my eyes scanning line after line. 12,000 in credit card debt. Emily's name on charges for designer handbags, boutique hotel stays, and a wine subscription that cost more than a month of groceries. Michael wasn't far behind late payments on his car loan, gym membership fees. He never used random charges at high-end electronics stores. They weren't struggling. They were drowning. And now they wanted to pull me under with them. My pen scratched across my notebook, listing account numbers, balances, due dates. Every line of data was a loose brick in the wall they thought they'd built around me, and I was prying them out one by one. Then I found the foreclosure notice. It was for a condo they'd bragged about last year, a smart investment, they said. Now it was bleeding money. 2 months behind on payments with a final warning printed in bold red ink. The same property they had tried to hide from me. The same one they were secretly planning to sell to bankroll their upgrades to my home. I smiled tight and bitter. They were reckless, and arrogance makes people sloppy. I slid the paper into my folder and continued digging. A printed invoice for a spa retreat, a receipt for a $2,000 dining table Emily had shipped to a storage unit just in case. These weren't needs. They were weapons. They were building their comfort on my silence. The house creaked. My head snapped up, heart suddenly pounding. I flicked off the flashlight and pressed myself against the kitchen counter. Footsteps moved above me, slow, deliberate. Then a pause. I waited frozen. Nothing. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock in the living room. I exhaled. They were still asleep, or at least unaware. For now. I flicked the light back on and finished scanning the last few papers, making notes. My engineering mind wasn't just remembering numbers, it was drawing a schematic of their collapse. When I was done, I slipped everything back into the pile, making it look untouched. I heard another floorboard creak closer this time. I grabbed the notebook, turned off the flashlight, and moved toward the kitchen door. My boots made no sound. Years of habit, years of early mornings and late nights had trained me to move through this house like part of it. I touched the edge of the doorframe, feeling its familiar coolness. Dad Michael's voice drifted down the hall, suspicious, still groggy but alert. I didn't answer. I slipped out of the kitchen like a shadow, my heart steady, my mind sharper than it had been in years. Let them sleep in their illusion a little longer. I had everything I needed, and soon they would realize they had handed me the very tools I would use to dismantle them. I slipped out the back door and into the early December air, the snow crunching beneath my boots like brittle bones. The street was still asleep, hushed beneath a blanket of white. My breath curled in the cold, but I didn't feel it. My body moved on instinct, now driven by something deeper than anger. This wasn't about revenge for pride. It was about survival of dignity. I knew exactly where to go. The Old Oak Tavern still opened at 9, just like it had since 1973, and Tom always sat in the back booth near the dusty jukebox that hadn't played anything new since Reagan was president. He was already there, nursing a cup of burnt black coffee when I slid into the seat across from him. "You look like hell," he said without looking up. "Thanks for noticing," I replied. I pulled out my notebook and laid it on the table like a blueprint. Tom didn't waste time. His eyes narrowed as I flipped to the page with bank account numbers, debt totals, copies of receipts, timelines, and a preliminary outline of what I had in mind. He tapped one line with a calloused finger. 12 grand in revolving credit. 3 missed payments on the condo. You're sitting on a gold mine of negligence. He leaned back, folding his arms. They try to come after your assets, you throw this in their face and watch them burn. I nodded. They think they're clever, but they left the kindling all over the floor. He reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a legal pad. "You want to start with freezing that joint account," he said, already writing. "He's probably still using the one you helped him open in 2009 when he bought that rust bucket of a car. Didn't even bother to take your name off. Lazy." I smirked despite myself. I figured as much. "We'll do it clean," Tom continued. "No theatrics. Change the will, lock the accounts, and restructure the deed into a trust. Once that's in place, even if they try to force you out, they've got nothing. No legal leverage, no access. They'll be squatters in a house they never paid a dime for." I stared at the scuffed tabletop, running my fingers along the groove someone had carved into the wood decades ago. Do it all, I said. Everything. Tom looked at me then not like an old friend, but like a strategist weighing his general. You sure they want to destroy me in front of the whole family? At Christmas dinner. The words sat heavy in the air. They're going to say I'm mentally unfit, that I need guardianship, maybe even force me into a facility. It's not just about the house, Tom. They want to erase me. For a moment, Tom was quiet. Then he pushed the pad toward me. Then we make sure they fail. Publicly. Permanently. By the time I left the tavern, the plan was drafted. My briefcase carried more than documents. It held precision history and a reckoning carved in black ink. I stopped by the bank, then the lawyer's office. Every signature felt like a nail, every stamp a strike of the hammer. When I returned home, I didn't go inside. I stood across the street, watching the lights flicker through the window, picturing them inside, Michael lounging on the couch, Emily sipping her overpriced wine, thinking they'd won. But what they didn't know was this: I had already dismantled the foundation beneath them, and all that remained was gravity. The collapse would be their doing. I was simply letting it fall. The following evening, the house was quiet, the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from premeditation. I sat in the darkened kitchen, the glow of my phone screen the only light. Papers were spread across the table once more, only this time I wasn't studying them for my own understanding. I was preparing them for someone else's judgment. Every receipt, every overdue notice, every screenshot of Emily's messages to relatives, whispering half-truths about my mental state. They were all sorted, labeled, and ready to be deployed. The calm before their chaos. I had always believed in structure and logic, in building something that lasted. They had weaponized that belief, thinking my silence meant weakness, but they had mistaken my patience for permission. I heard footsteps above, soft but deliberate. They were moving again, probably planning another strategy now that I had gone silent. They thought I was sulking, licking my wounds like a beaten dog. What they didn't understand was that I'd already made my move. Their attempt to isolate me, changing the locks, spreading rumors to relatives, whispering that I was unfit, wasn't clever. It was desperate. And desperation makes people careless. I leaned back, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. The folder on the table was heavier than its paper contents would suggest. It held years of labor, trust, betrayal, and now evidence. I rose and made my way toward the hallway, my steps soft out of habit. I passed the photo wall pictures of Elizabeth, of Michael as a child, of Christmas mornings that once sparkled with joy. I didn't pause. Sentiment had its place, and it wasn't tonight. I opened the hall closet, reached behind the linens, and pulled out the small safe I had installed when Elizabeth got sick. Inside were backups, copies of everything, flash drives, hard paper trails, notarized letters. My plan didn't rely on one folder or one confrontation. It was layered, redundant, like a well-built bridge. I didn't want revenge for the sake of pain. I wanted consequence. I wanted closure. Later, I sat in the garage with the door slightly ajar, watching the snowfall coat the driveway. I sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos Elizabeth had given me 20 years ago. The rubber grip was cracked, but it still held heat, and right now, that was enough. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Another message from Linda, my sister-in-law. Michael says you're not well. Please call me Henry. I stared at it for a long moment before locking the screen again. The betrayal wasn't just from my son, it was spreading, seeping into people I once trusted. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just resolved. The next morning, I met with John, my lawyer. The office was quiet, clinical. He reviewed everything I brought, flipping through pages without blinking. You've done most of the work already, he said. It's clear. They've overreached, and you've documented everything." He leaned forward. "Do you want to serve them the eviction before or after Christmas?" I looked out the window at the gray skyline cars inching below like ants in winter. "At dinner," I said. "They're planning something. I'll give them their audience. Let them make their play. Then I'll make mine." John gave a slow nod like a man watching a fuse burning toward the powder. "Then we make sure the explosion lands in your favor." He slid a pen toward me, and I signed the new will, the trust paperwork, the financial freezes. Every line was clean, every clause airtight. The house was now in a trust they couldn't touch. The account they abused was frozen under my exclusive control. Their financial noose had already begun to tighten, and they didn't even feel it yet. But they would. Soon. Very soon. That evening I returned to the house like a ghost. I didn't knock. I didn't use a key. I had no reason to pretend anymore. I entered through the side gate, walked the length of the backyard, and stood beneath the window to the living room. The blinds were slightly parted. Inside, Michael was pacing his phone clutched in his hand like it was the last lifeline he had. His mouth moved quickly, frustration in every gesture. Emily lounged on the leather couch, the same one from the magazine photo she'd once shown me at dinner. Legs crossed, wine glass in hand, composed but watching him unravel. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, my phone already recording. "I tried to pay the car loan," Michael said, his voice cracking. "The payment bounced. Everything's frozen." Emily raised an eyebrow. "It's probably a glitch." I called the bank. He tossed a magazine across the room. "They said the account was locked by the primary holder. That's Dad. He did this." Her calm faltered for a moment. Then her eyes narrowed. "He's doing this out of spite. He thinks he can control us from the grave." Michael threw his arms up. "He's not even dead." Emily stood, setting her wine down. "Then maybe it's time we make some real moves." She walked to the window, her silhouette framed by the glow of the television. I pressed tighter against the wall, every nerve alert. Inside, they kept talking too, wrapped in their panic, to imagine anyone might be listening. "We need to move quickly," Emily said. "The lawyer says if we get enough family to agree, we can push for guardianship. Declare him mentally unfit. Then we control the house, his accounts, everything." My stomach twisted, not in fear, but in recognition. This wasn't an act of heat-of-the-moment rage. This was a campaign, a takeover. They weren't just trying to remove me, they wanted to rewrite who I was. Erase the decades, the sacrifices, the history. Turn me into a footnote. Michael slumped onto the couch, rubbing his face. "He won't go quietly. You know how stubborn he is." "Then we don't ask," Emily replied, her voice colder now. "We serve him paperwork. Get the family involved. Make it look like a kindness. He's old Michael, vulnerable. We'll say it's for his own good. A smaller place. Less stress. Frame it like concern." I heard enough. I ended the recording, saved it to the cloud, and tucked the phone deep into my coat pocket. The cold no longer bit at me. I was burning from the inside out. They wanted to call me unstable, I would let them. I'd sit in that room, calm and smiling, while they made their declarations. I would wait until they felt completely secure, until the lie became their truth. Then I would lay my truth on the table, one document, one signature, one recording at a time. Not in anger, not with noise, but with the precision of a man who spent his life building things that never cracked. Let them build their house of glass. I already had the first stone. The next day I sat in the corner booth of a cafe Elizabeth used to love, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. Outside, the city moved with its usual winter pace, slow-bundled, unaware. Across from me sat Sarah Elizabeth's closest friend, wrapped in a red scarf that matched the streak of concern in her voice. She leaned in, eyes darting around the cafe like she expected someone to be listening. "Henry," she whispered, "I heard something. From Linda, from your cousins. They're planning something for Christmas dinner. Not just a meal, an announcement." I didn't blink. I just took another sip, letting her words settle. "They've been telling people you're not well," she continued. "That you're confused. That you're not managing your affairs." Emily said something about guardianship. Michael's calling relatives to get them on his side. I nodded slowly, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed everything I had already documented. "It's a campaign," I said quietly. "A quiet coup. They want to turn my own blood against me under the guise of care." Sarah's hand hovered near mine on the table. "Are you going to let them?" I looked at her then out the window where snow drifted across the sidewalk like ash. "They think they're clever, but they forgot who built this house, who structured every beam and joint. They think because I'm quiet, I'm weak. But I'm just patient." That afternoon, I returned to the lawyer's office with a heavier folder and a clearer focus. John reviewed the updated documentation with a nod of approval. "The eviction notices are ready," he said, "and the updated will is tight. They won't get a penny. The house is under the trust. Their names aren't even a footnote." He slid the pages toward me. "We'll serve them the moment you give the word." I signed every document without hesitation. The ink bled clean. My hands were steady. "What about the evidence?" I asked. "It's all there," John replied, tapping the folder. "The recording of their conversation, the screenshots of Emily's texts, the bank statements. It's more than enough if they want to fight in court. But I suspect they won't. Bullies rarely do when they lose control of the narrative." I tucked the folder under my arm as I left the office, snow falling again, dusting my shoulders like forgiveness. But there would be no forgiveness. Not yet. I passed by holiday lights and carolers and people hurrying to buy last-minute gifts. My hands tightened around the folder. My gift was already wrapped. I was saving it for Christmas dinner, the stage they had built for my downfall. They thought they would be met with silence. Instead, they would be met with structure, precision, and proof. I wasn't coming for vengeance. I was coming for accountability. That night I slept without dreams for the first time in weeks. The house was quiet, but not tense. It was waiting. The air felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. In just a few days, Michael and Emily would stand before the family and try to strip me of my name, my dignity, my home. I would let them speak, let them reveal the worst of themselves. Then I would stand folder in hand and show everyone what they truly were. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to cry. All I needed was the truth. And now I had it all. Christmas Eve arrived cloaked in quiet tension. The house was decorated to impress pine-scented candles flickered in the entryway. Elizabeth's old china gleamed beneath the dining room lights, and the table was set like a stage. Michael stood at the head, rehearsing his lines with every glass of wine he poured. Emily floated around the room, all smiles and whispered asides, touching shoulders, greeting relatives with warmth just thick enough to mask calculation. I watched it unfold from the living room archway, unnoticed, unseen, as they built the perfect environment for my undoing. The guests arrived slowly, each coat taken with politeness, each smile hiding curiosity. Word had spread. Emily had been working the phones, crafting the narrative. "Poor Henry's not himself. He needs help, but he won't accept it. We're just trying to do what's best for him." The whispers traveled faster than the scent of roast turkey. I took my seat without a word, placing the plain folder beneath my chair. It sat there quietly, yet carried more weight than anything else in the room. Michael raised his glass, tapping it lightly with a spoon. The room fell still, save for the crackle of the fireplace and the soft clink of silverware being set down. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm, practiced. "This year has brought challenges, but also clarity. We believe, Emily and I, that it's time to make some necessary changes." He turned to me, his tone carefully composed. "Dad, this house, this life, it's become too much for you. We've talked about this before, and with everyone here, we wanted to be honest. We've decided together that it's time for you to step away." The room held its breath. Some looked confused, others concerned, a few nodding awkwardly, as if unsure what response was appropriate. Emily placed her hand on Michael's arm, her voice rising with just enough tremble to seem sincere. "We love you, Henry. But we can't ignore the signs anymore. The missed conversations, the confusion. It's time for rest, not responsibility." I didn't speak. Not yet. I let their words stretch across the table like a net, watched the expressions shift, Linda biting her lip, Tom narrowing his eyes, Sarah leaning forward ever so slightly. Then I stood. My chair scraped the hardwood. Every eye turned toward me, expecting denial, maybe even tears. Instead, I reached down, pulled the folder from beneath my chair, and laid it gently on the table. Michael's smile flickered. Emily's fingers froze around her wine glass. "You're right," I said quietly. "There have been decisions made, but not just by you." I slid the folder toward Michael. "Consider this my version of honesty." He opened it, and I watched the blood drain from his face. The eviction notice sat on top, crisp and legal. Beneath it, court orders account, freezes a copy of the revised will, and the transcript of the recording from a few nights ago, every word he and Emily had spoken when they thought I wasn't listening. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became gasps. Michael looked up, eyes wide with panic. Emily reached for the folder, but Tom grabbed it first, scanning the pages like a man reading a verdict. And then came the shift. The performance collapsed. The applause they expected never came. Instead, the silence turned on them, not me. The very people they'd tried to manipulate now saw the truth laid bare. I remained still, calm, steady. Let them scramble for their excuses. Let them claw at their story. My part was done. The structure I had built, layer by layer, note by note, was holding, and now they were the ones standing on shaking ground. The room cracked open, not with shouting, but with something colder exposure. Emily's voice faltered, first thin and reedy. This is taken out of context." She stammered, her fingers trembling as she tried to gather the scattered documents. Her words didn't carry. No one reached to help. Linda picked up one of the pages, reading the transcript of Emily suggesting guardianship. Her jaw tightened. "You said he was confused. You told me he forgot your name." She turned to me, then back to them. "But this is premeditated." Tom stood next to a copy of the foreclosure notice in his hand. "You told the whole family he couldn't manage his finances. Meanwhile, you're hiding unpaid debts and planning to sell the house behind his back." Michael's face flushed, wine-stained and cracking beneath the weight of the truth. "It's not what it looks like," he said weakly. "We were trying to help." The words landed like hollow stones. The child at the far end of the table ducked behind his mother, startled by the tension. Sarah's voice rang out clear and firm. "You tried to destroy your father's reputation for a condo and a furniture set." Her eyes shifted to Emily. "And you smiling and scheming while pretending to care. How dare you stand in this house and call him a burden? Emily tried to recover, lifting her chin as her voice broke. We only wanted what was best for him. But the performance had ended. The script had unraveled. Michael reached for the folder again, as if he could rewind the moment. I let him. I wanted him to feel every word he had spoken in secret now bouncing back in judgment. You recorded us, he said, his voice rising into accusation. I nodded once. You wanted evidence. So did I. His fists clenched, crumpling the eviction notice in his hand. You can't throw us out. This is our home too. I stepped forward, then not with rage but clarity. No. It's mine. Always has been. You were guests. Ungrateful ones. And now it's time you go. Emily's posture collapsed. She sat slowly, stunned, her manicured hands falling to her lap. Michael turned toward the guests, searching for a lifeline, but they were already rising from the table. Coats were collected, awkward nods exchanged. Some refused to meet his eyes. Others stared openly, letting the truth settle like frost on a windshield. Linda paused at my side, her expression laced with regret. I'm sorry, Henry. I should have seen it sooner. I gave her a slight nod. I didn't need her apology. I had the truth, and that was enough. As the front door opened and closed in slow succession, I looked around the dining room, Elizabeth's china now smudged with shame, the tablecloth wrinkled, and torn, the candles flickering in the wake of a storm. Michael stood in the center hollow and humiliated, while Emily remained frozen in her chair. Their kingdom had crumbled in a single night, not from rage or spectacle, but from the weight of their own words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't strike them down. I simply revealed them. And now they had to live with what they'd done. I turned away without another word, the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood the only farewell they would get. The morning after Christmas, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted. It was the silence that follows a storm, debris still hanging in the air, though the thunder's gone. I stood in the doorway of the dining room, hands in my coat pockets, looking over what was left behind. A wine glass tipped on its side, the tablecloth stained with gravy, and spilled pride, crumpled papers near the centerpiece like fallen leaves. The scent of roasted turkey lingered, mixing with something bitter, the residue of betrayal exposed. Michael and Emily were gone. They didn't sleep here last night. After the guests left and the last door slammed, I heard their suitcases being dragged across the floor, the back door opening, then nothing. I sat at the head of the table where Michael had stood the night before. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and tried to summon Elizabeth's voice. She would have hated the drama, but she would have approved of the truth. I imagined her sitting beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine as she used to do when I overthought every hard decision. She always believed in quiet strength. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the eviction notices folded crisp, still unsigned by the sheriff. Legally, I could give them 30 days. Morally, they were already gone. But closure required process. I would follow it. Later that day, I visited the bank again. The young man behind the counter looked nervous when I handed him the document to finalize the account freeze. His tie was slightly askew, and he smelled of cologne and hesitation. "Are you sure, Mr. Wilson?" he asked, tapping his keyboard. "Once we do this, your son won't be able to access anything." I nodded. "That's the idea." He nodded slowly, processed the forms, and handed me a confirmation slip. I tucked it neatly into my folder. No more late-night Amazon orders on my dime. No more overdraft notices that somehow became my responsibility. It was over. By the time I got back to the house, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees. I stood outside for a long while, staring at the place I had poured my life into. Every shingle, every nail, every paint job on the trim, I remembered them all. Michael used to help me when he was little. He held the ladder steady when I fixed the gutters. Now he'd tried to take the very structure he once admired. And for what? A newer couch, a modern backsplash. I walked the perimeter of the house, checking locks, testing windows. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The same hands that built this house were now protecting it. Inside, I collected what little remained of Michael and Emily's presence. A pair of her heels left near the stairwell, one of his ties tossed across a chair. I put them in a box, not with anger, but with purpose. The house needed to breathe again. It had been held hostage by pretense dressed in politeness, masking rot. I opened the windows, letting the cold air rush in. It felt like a purge. Somewhere down the street, wine chimes rang. I stood there listening, steadying myself. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. I hadn't just taken back my home, I had taken back my name, my legacy, my right to be seen, not as a burden, but as a man who still stood tall. That evening, I sat alone in the study, the soft hum of the heater filling the quiet. The room smelled faintly of old leather and pine from the tree still standing in the corner, half decorated, abandoned in the days leading up to the disaster. I hadn't touched it since Michael and Emily took over the holiday planning. They said I didn't understand modern aesthetics. I let them strip away the ornaments Elizabeth and I had collected over decades, replacing them with sleek glass trinkets that meant nothing to anyone. Now I sat across from that tree, its cold beauty hollow, watching the lights blink in slow surrender. The fireplace crackled beside me, casting shadows across the bookshelves. I picked up the notebook again, not to review, but to reflect. Every page was filled now, accounts, timelines, statements, evidence. But what I hadn't written yet was what mattered most, what comes next. Because the truth is, after you dismantle something so thoroughly, you're left with the silence of your own victory. And silence has its own weight. I wasn't angry anymore. That emotion had burned itself out. What lingered was something harder to describe, like standing in the ruins of a building you once loved, knowing you had no choice but to bring it down. I opened the drawer to the desk and found a small envelope Elizabeth had labeled, "In case you ever forget why you're doing all this." It was written in her handwriting, round, careful, full of patience. Inside was a photo of the three of us. Michael, at age 8, perched on my shoulders, laughing uncontrollably, while Elizabeth held his hand to steady him. I remembered that day. It was at the lake right before the thunderstorms rolled in. He had been scared of the lightning clinging to my neck, trusting me to protect him. I looked at that photo, now tracing the edges with my thumb. That boy was gone, and maybe part of me still held out hope he'd come back. But hope was no longer strategy. It was memory. My phone buzzed against the desk. A message from Linda. "They're saying you manipulated the family, that you ambushed them." I stared at the screen. Of course they were. The narrative always bends to protect the ego. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The people who mattered had seen enough. The rest would believe what made them most comfortable. I had stopped living for their comfort the moment my son stood in front of our family and declared I no longer belonged. Later that night, I packed up a few boxes, not everything, just enough to feel a shift. A few books Elizabeth loved, my drafting tools, the blueprints for this house drawn by hand from the time when I still believed permanence could be designed. I wasn't leaving, not yet, but I was preparing. Preparing to live without bitterness, even if forgiveness never came. Preparing to move towards something smaller, quieter, and mine again. This home had become a battlefield, and I was done fighting in places meant for peace. I glanced around the study one last time before shutting off the lamp. The shadows swallowed the room as I walked out, box in hand, past the blinking lights of a tree that no longer knew who it was meant to honor. The next morning brought a heavy stillness, like the house itself was catching its breath. I stood at the kitchen sink, pouring hot water over a tea bag, staring out the window at the snow-covered street. The quiet was different now, not the sharp silence of betrayal, but something softer, like the beginning of distance. Across the street, I saw neighbors pulling recycling bins to the curb, bundled in layers, living ordinary lives. No one looked toward my house. No one needed to. Word had already spread. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea warming my hands, the same table where I used to read the paper, while Elizabeth hummed in the background, her voice quieter than the radio. It felt like another life. Maybe it was. The documents were still laid out in front of me. I didn't need to read them anymore. I had memorized every clause, every timeline. The trust was solid. The eviction was enforceable. The accounts were locked. And now the next step wasn't about legal action. It was about transition. I wasn't rebuilding the house, I was releasing it. That afternoon, I made 3 calls. First to the real estate agent Elizabeth and I had used years ago when we thought about downsizing. Her voice was warm, steady. She didn't ask why I was ready now. She just listened. Then I called the local charity, the same one Elizabeth volunteered at for years. I told them I wanted to set up a scholarship fund in her name tied to the proceeds from the house. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice cracked. She would have loved that. Finally, I called a moving service. Not because I was rushing out, but because the decision had been made. Emotionally, I had already left. Michael hadn't called. Not since the dinner. Emily hadn't either. I suspected they were licking their wounds in silence, maybe scrambling for another plan, or just laying low, hoping this would all fade like a bad dream. But it wouldn't. Some acts carve their place too deep. That evening, I sat in the garage again, the box of old ornaments beside me. I picked up one Michael's handprint in clay from when he was 5. The paint had faded, but his name was still etched in crooked letters. I held it for a long time before placing it gently back inside. I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. Tired of holding memories that had turned into weights. I wrote a letter that night, not to be sent, not to be read, just to be said. A letter to the son I once had, the boy who brought me joy before ambition took root. I told him I loved him. I told him I mourned him. And I told him goodbye. I folded the page, slipped it into the same envelope where I kept Elizabeth's old recipes, and placed it in the drawer. There were no fireworks, no collapse. Just closure, quiet and steady. The kind only earned through fire. The house began to feel like a stranger. Each room I passed through whispered of what used to be, but nothing held warmth anymore. The living room, once full of Sunday laughter and quiet evenings with Elizabeth curled beside me, had turned into a showroom for Emily's ambitions. The couch they bought, cold leather with sharp edges, looked more like a lobby fixture than a place anyone would sit to rest. I stood in front of the fireplace and looked up at the mantel where family photos used to line the wood. Only one remained, a black and white shot of Elizabeth on our wedding day. I left it there not because I needed the reminder, but because it was the only truth the room still held. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Linda standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me with eyes full of something between guilt and curiosity. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She entered slowly, scanning the house like it was the first time she'd really seen it. I led her to the kitchen, poured her a cup of coffee, and sat across from her at the table. She glanced at the documents still neatly stacked nearby. "So it's all true," she said. "Not a question." A realization. Everything they accused you of it was all projection. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She nodded slowly. I owe you an apology. I watched her struggle with the weight of her own silence, the way she'd stayed quiet during Michael's performance at Christmas dinner. She hadn't defended me, but she hadn't attacked either. She'd watched like so many others, unsure of who to believe, until the truth became undeniable. I let myself get pulled into their narrative, she said. It was easier than questioning the version of the story that made them victims. I stirred my coffee without looking up. People believe what costs them the least, I said, until the truth becomes more expensive to ignore. She looked down at her hands. They're saying you planned all this out of spite, that you embarrassed them on purpose. I gave a faint smile. I didn't embarrass them. They did that themselves. I just opened the window. We sat in silence for a while. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. From Sarah. She asked me to give this to you. Said it was something Elizabeth wrote before she passed. She kept forgetting to give it to you. My fingers tightened around the envelope. I nodded, said nothing. After she left, I waited until the sky darkened before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in Elizabeth's hand. It was a list not of regrets or confessions, but memories. Our first dance, the night Michael was born, the last time she saw snow before the cancer returned. At the bottom, she had written, "Don't let the ending undo the story. You built this. You kept us together. When you're alone again, remember what it cost and why it was worth it." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. My breath shook as I exhaled. There were no tears left, only understanding. I hadn't lost everything. I had just shed what no longer belonged. What remained was mine, and it was enough. By New Year's Day, the house felt quieter than ever, not in mourning, but in recovery. The air had shifted, less like tension, more like relief. I walked through each room methodically, checking drawers, boxing up what didn't belong, setting aside what still carried meaning. Michael and Emily hadn't returned. No calls, no messages. The deadline on the eviction notice was drawing near, but they seemed to understand that coming back would only confirm what had already been proven. They had no ground left to stand on. I wasn't waiting for closure. I already had it. In the guest room, I found a stack of unopened mail with Michael's name still listed on the address. Credit card statements, a notice from a collection agency, a glossy brochure for a luxury kitchen remodel. I placed them all in a manila envelope and set it on the front hall table, one final package waiting to be claimed or ignored. I didn't care which. I wasn't their keeper anymore. I stepped outside for air, the porch creaking beneath me. The wind was sharp, the kind that makes your lungs tighten and your thoughts clear. Across the street, the neighborhood felt unchanged, children building snowmen, a couple walking their dog, the same man scraping ice from his windshield with a CD case. But I felt different. I was no longer part of the machinery built around obligation and assumption. I had stepped out of it. Back inside, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat in the sunroom, where the light always hit best in the late morning. Elizabeth used to read there, her feet tucked beneath her face tilted toward the window like she was listening for something only she could hear. I brought the small box of keepsakes with me, her scarf, the photo of us by the lake, and Michael's old drawing from kindergarten, our family stick figures holding hands. I studied that crayon drawing longer than I expected. The smile he gave me in that picture was bigger than the sun he'd drawn in the corner. Children don't lie in their drawings. Only time teaches them to withhold. I held the page gently, but I didn't cry. I simply folded it back into the box and closed the lid. That little boy was gone. The man he became had burned every bridge. I had tried to protect the memory of who he was, but not at the cost of who I had to be now. I needed peace more than I needed reconciliation. I picked up the phone and dialed the moving company again. "Let's schedule the date," I told them. "Sooner the better." I had found an apartment in the city just a few blocks from the lake. Nothing extravagant, just space to think, to rest, to start fresh, without the ghosts pressing in on every wall. Later that evening, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, looking one last time at the place that had held so much joy, so much pain. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I just felt ready. Ready to step into a life not dictated by guilt or duty. Ready to live on my own terms, no longer haunted by what-ifs. I turned off the light, closed the door behind me, and for the first time in years felt the distinct sensation of forward motion. The apartment was small, clean, and quiet. The walls were bare, save for a single photograph I'd already unpacked. Elizabeth sitting on the front porch of our old house, barefoot, holding a cup of tea, her eyes half closed in the sun. I hung it across from the kitchen table not for sentimentality, but because it reminded me of clarity. She'd always said simplicity was a kind of freedom. This space offered exactly that. No history pressing against the walls, no expectations waiting in the hallway. Just 4 rooms, a view of the lake, and a key that fit only in my hand. I spent the first few days getting used to the rhythm of it. Waking when I pleased, cooking simple meals, taking long walks along the shoreline wrapped in a heavy coat, and thoughts that no longer swirled with anger. I stopped answering calls. Most had quieted anyway. Whatever story Michael and Emily were spinning had lost its momentum. A few distant relatives reached out vaguely hinting at what a shame it all became, but I let the messages go unanswered. I had no space left for revisionists. Those who stood silent when it mattered didn't get a seat at my new table. One morning, while sorting through boxes, I came across a sealed letter. It wasn't one I had written. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the postmark smeared, but the return address caught my attention. It was Michael's from 2 years ago. Curiosity won out. I sat down and opened it slowly. The letter inside was short. Just a few lines. He had written it after Elizabeth's funeral, trying to say something, anything. "Dad, I don't know how to be around you right now. Everything feels wrong. I want to be better. I don't know how." That was it. No apology, no signature, just a folded attempt unsent until now. I stared at it for a long time, the words ringing louder for what they didn't say. I didn't feel moved. Not in the way someone might expect. But I did feel something else, a flicker of sadness, dull and settled. Not for what he'd done recently, but for the years that could have been different. I placed the letter back in the envelope and slid it into the back of the drawer. It didn't change anything. But it didn't need to. I had my clarity. And now I had my distance. Later that evening, I poured a small glass of whiskey and sat by the window. The city lights flickered along the lake. Reflections swaying like old memories just out of reach. I thought about the house, probably still sitting quiet, the dust beginning to settle the air, stale without presence. I had listed it that morning with the agent. She called to say interest was high, offers were already coming in. It would sell quickly. The money would be enough to carry me through the rest of my years with a sizable gift left for the charity Elizabeth loved. That legacy mattered more than passing it to hands that would only tear it apart. I took a sip, savoring the burn. I wasn't looking back anymore. I had done what needed to be done. Not out of cruelty. Not even for justice, but for peace. A man shouldn't have to explain his worth to his own blood. And if they make you, then maybe they were never yours to begin with. The city lights blinked. I raised my glass to no one and whispered, to starting over. Not a celebration, just a quiet truth spoken into the night. The next week moved like water, slow, inevitable. The apartment filled slowly with the kind of things you buy when you're starting from scratch at 72. A modest couch, a reading lamp, a kettle that whistled too loud, but reminded me of mornings from decades ago. I didn't rush to decorate. I didn't need to. Every item I placed had a reason, a weight, a purpose. There was no room for noise anymore, only space for meaning. I walked the lake path daily, nodding at strangers, keeping my world small and manageable. Some days I stopped by the charity office to finalize the paperwork for the fund in Elizabeth's name. They offered to put up a plaque. I declined. She never cared for credit. She just wanted the work done. That was enough. Then one afternoon the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, something in me too tired to avoid the inevitable. Dad. It was Michael. His voice cracked like it hadn't quite healed from the embarrassment of Christmas. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was, just said my name like it was a question. I didn't respond right away. I waited. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, he said. But I thought, maybe I could just talk for a minute. I said nothing. Let the silence fill the line. He took it as permission. We're not doing great, he admitted. Emily and I. Things fell apart after the dinner. People stopped returning our calls. Her parents cut off support. We lost the condo. His voice faltered. I guess I didn't see how bad things were. I guess I messed it all up. Still, I said nothing. He exhaled long and slow. I went back to the house once, just for a minute. It didn't feel right. It felt like it belonged to someone else. I thought maybe you'd be there, but it was already empty. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the same cityscape I'd come to depend on. It didn't blink. It didn't flinch. It just kept going. I don't know if this means anything to you, Michael said, voice quieter now. But I'm sorry. For all of it. For how I spoke to you. For letting Emily push you out. For forgetting who you were before you were just the guy we blamed for everything we didn't want to face. There was a pause. Long. Uneasy. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not really. He was reaching for something that might not exist anymore. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. Calm. Clear. I hope you find your way, Michael. I really do. He waited for more. I gave him nothing. He didn't deserve comfort, only clarity. And I had nothing left to give but the boundary. Take care of yourself, I said. Then I ended the call. I set the phone down and stared at my reflection in the window. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. But I felt clean. Like I'd rinsed something foul from my skin. He had finally said the words. But they came too late to undo the damage. Some bridges don't burn. They crumble slowly, until one day you realize you're standing on opposite cliffs, waving across a canyon no apology can span. I turned back to the living room where a pot of tea had just begun to boil. I had no intention of looking back. The day the house officially sold, I didn't drive by for one last look. I didn't need to. I had already walked away long before the ink dried. The real estate agent called in the morning to confirm the closing had gone smoothly. A young family had bought it, a couple with 2 kids and another on the way. They'd fallen in love with the big oak tree in the backyard and the sunroom that Elizabeth once claimed as her sanctuary. The agent said the new owners planned to keep the fireplace and restore the hardwood floors. I nodded along, thanked her, and hung up. Then I stood in the center of my apartment and exhaled. It was done. That evening, I pulled the last remaining box from the hallway closet. Inside were the things I wasn't sure I'd ever unpack. Loose photographs, faded letters, pieces of a life that didn't belong on shelves anymore. I sat on the floor and spread them out like puzzle pieces. One by one, I held them up to the light. A photo of Michael on his first bike helmet, too big mouth open in mid-laugh. A note from Elizabeth left inside my lunchbox the day I presented my first building design to the city board. You already built everything that matters. A receipt for the engagement ring I had bought 47 years ago, still creased in the middle, still taped to a post-it, with her ring size scribbled in my handwriting. These weren't things I needed. They were things I had honored. And now it was time to let some of them go. I gathered a few into a smaller box, one I'd keep. The rest I placed into a paper bag. I wouldn't throw them away. I'd donate them to the local historical archive, the one where Elizabeth had volunteered on weekends. She always said the past didn't need to be buried, only placed somewhere it could rest with dignity. As night fell, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. Across the alley, a family in the next building was sitting down to dinner. Their laughter floated through the air in muffled bursts, soft and human. I didn't envy them. I didn't grieve what I'd lost. I had grieved already, quietly, completely. What remained now was space-clean, unburdened space. I hadn't created it by force. I had earned it by choice. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened a blank notebook. Not the one filled with evidence and plans that one was packed away. This one was new. The first page stayed empty for a while. Then I wrote a single line at the top. Where do we begin when we're no longer trying to fix what broke us? I didn't write anything else. Just closed the book, satisfied to leave the question unanswered for now. That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no noise, just the simple truth of a man who had reclaimed his life one quiet step at a time. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing at the gates of the community center, where Elizabeth had spent most of her Saturdays sorting canned goods, organizing coat drives, never asking for thanks. The new director, a young woman named Mara, greeted me with a warmth that wasn't forced. She didn't look at me like a man who had lost everything. She looked at me like someone who might still have something to offer. I handed her the check. It wasn't small. The proceeds from the sale of the house minus what I needed to live comfortably. I'd already rewritten my will. I didn't need statues or benches with my name carved into them. I just wanted something to grow from what had been taken. Mara tried to speak, but I stopped her. Use it where it matters. No plaques. No fuss. She nodded, eyes damp but steady. We'll put it to work. That was enough for me. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the bulletin board by the door, flyers for winter coat drives, hot meal nights, reading hours for kids. Elizabeth would have smiled at that. She believed in small efforts with big ripples. I walked home through the cold wind cutting across my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was still here, still moving, still part of something. Back in the apartment, I made soup. Nothing fancy, just something warm. I listened to the radio, some old jazz tune Elizabeth used to hum while folding laundry. The apartment smelled of thyme and onions and peace. I sat by the window, watching as dusk settled over the city. I didn't think about Michael. Not much anyway. I didn't wonder if he and Emily had found their footing again, or if they were still unraveling. That chapter was closed. I'd written its ending with a steady hand. They had taken enough of me. I had no intention of letting them steal the future, too. Later that evening, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Michael's still a little messy, still trying too hard to look neat. I sat with it for a moment before opening. Inside, just a single sheet. No apology, no request. Just a short paragraph. I know we won't be what we were, but I hope someday I can become someone you'd want to know again. I read it once, then again. Then I folded it, slid it into the drawer, and poured myself a cup of tea. There was no bitterness, only understanding. Some things don't return. Some bridges are meant to stand in memory only. And sometimes the most honest form of peace is silence. I didn't write back. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. The story had already been told, and I had already begun a new one with fewer characters, fewer wounds, but far more truth. A month passed. The snow began to melt, slowly, revealing the cracks in the sidewalks and the yellowed patches of grass that had waited out the cold. The lake thawed in layers, its still surface shifting gently in the wind. Life moved forward in subtle, ordinary ways, and I found a rhythm in that. Mornings came without dread. Nights passed without the weight of memory pressing against my chest. I woke when I wanted to. I walked for the sake of moving, not to escape. I cooked simple meals and read books I'd forgotten I owned. And I breathed. One afternoon, I visited the charity center again, not to deliver checks or attend a meeting, but just to sit. Mara offered me tea and led me to a quiet bench near the reading room. Children's laughter echoed softly in the background as I watched a group of volunteers organize shelves and sort winter jackets. I didn't need to explain why I was there. Mara didn't ask. Sometimes presence was enough. I stayed for over an hour, saying little, just letting the energy of the place fill the space inside me that used to ache. That night, I opened the drawer where I'd kept the few remaining items from the old house. Elizabeth's scarf, the letter Michael had sent, the folded recipe card she used every Thanksgiving for her cornbread stuffing. I took each item out one at a time, not to dwell, but to decide. I placed the scarf gently over the back of my reading chair. I returned the recipe card to my kitchen drawer, and the letter I tucked it back into its envelope and sealed it shut. It had been read. It had been felt. And now it was finished. I turned off the lights and walked to the window. The city glowed beneath me, small, flickering windows filled with other lives, other dinners, other stories. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a character left behind in someone else's chapter. I felt like the narrator of my own. The apartment no longer felt temporary. It felt like mine. The kind of quiet space that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The kind of peace you don't announce, you just live in it. As I stood there, arms folded, I whispered one thing into the silence, not a prayer, not a wish, just a truth. I did what I had to do. And that was enough. Not because it made me proud or because it ended in triumph, but because it ended. And now in the quiet that followed, something new had space to begin. Some stories don't end with applause or dramatic closure. They end in quiet, with a man standing alone by a window, knowing he finally chose himself. I didn't reclaim my dignity through revenge or cruelty, but through stillness, through truth. I learned that forgiveness isn't always for the person who wronged you. Sometimes it's the way you set the burden down so you can walk without it. If you're a parent clinging to hope that your sacrifice will be seen, I urge you don't lose yourself waiting for thanks. And if you're a child who's forgotten where you came from, think twice before calling the roots that raised you too old to matter. I've lived long enough to know silence can be louder than fury, and peace can be earned even late in life. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of family? Tell me your story. If this one touched you, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for listening.